How many countries have you visited? How many countries have you visited? How many siblings do you have? How many siblings do you have? How many languages do you speak? How many languages do you speak? How many books have you read this year? How many books have you read this year? How many pets do you have? How many pets do you have? How many friends do you keep in touch with regularly? How many friends do you keep in touch with regularly? How many hours of sleep do you get per night? How many hours of sleep do you get per night? How many cups of tea do you drink in a day? How many cups of coffee do you drink in a day? How many photos do you have in your camera roll? How many photos do you have in your camera roll? How many hours a week do you spend exercising? How many hours a week do you spend exercising? How many pairs of shoes do you own? How many pairs of shoes do you own? How many unread emails do you have in your inbox? How many unread emails do you have in your inbox? How many concerts have you been to? How many concerts have you been to? How many hours a day do you spend on social media? How many hours a day do you spend on social media? How many goals have you achieved this month? How many goals have you achieved this month? How many hours a week do you spend on health and fitness? How many hours a week do you spend on health and fitness? How many close friends do you have? How many close friends do you have? How many countries have you lived in? How many countries have you lived in? How many hours a week do you spend watching TV? How many hours a week do you spend watching TV? How many days a week do you cook at home? How many days a week do you cook at home? How many books do you own? How many books do you own? How many cars have you owned in your lifetime? How many cars have you owned in your lifetime? How many hours a day do you spend working or studying? How many hours a day do you spend working or studying? How many times have you moved in your life? How many times have you moved in your life? How many photos do you take on average in a week? How many photos do you take on average in a week? How many family members do you have? How many family members do you have? How many pieces of art do you own? How many pieces of art do you own? How many times have you been in love? How many times have you been in love? How many concerts have you attended in your lifetime? How many concerts have you attended in your lifetime? How many hours a week do you spend volunteering? How many hours a week do you spend volunteering? How many close friends have you made in the last year? How many close friends have you made in the last year? How many hours a day do you spend commuting? How many hours a day do you spend commuting? How many tattoos do you have? How many tattoos do you have? How many times have you been on a plane? How many times have you been on a plane? How many meals do you eat out in a week? How many meals do you eat out in a week? How many unread books do you have on your shelf? How many unread books do you have on your shelf? How many hours a week do you spend with family? How many hours a week do you spend with family? How many times have you been to the beach this year? How many times have you been to the beach this year? How many hobbies do you have? How many hobbies do you have? How many times have you been to a live sports event? How many times have you been to a live sports event? How many times have you gone camping? How many times have you gone camping? How many languages can you understand but not speak fluently? How many languages can you understand but not speak fluently? How many times have you been to a museum this year? How many times have you been to a museum this year? How many unread text messages do you have on your phone? How many unread text messages do you have on your phone? How many miles do you walk in a day on average? How many miles do you walk in a day on average? How many times have you dyed your hair? How many times have you dyed your hair? How many times have you gone hiking? How many times have you gone hiking? How many languages can you speak? How many languages can you speak? How many cups of coffee do you drink per day? How many cups of coffee do you drink per day? How many hours of sleep do you typically get? How many hours of sleep do you typically get? How many hours a week do you exercise? How many hours a week do you exercise? How many meals do you eat per day? How many meals do you eat per day? How many unread emails are currently in your inbox? How many unread emails are currently in your inbox? How many social media accounts do you have? How many social media accounts do you have? How many photos do you have on your phone? How many photos do you have on your phone? How many hours a day do you spend on your phone? How many hours a day do you spend on your phone? How many miles do you commute to work? How many miles do you commute to work? How many times do you check your phone per hour? How many times do you check your phone per hour? How many hours a day do you spend studying? How many hours a day do you spend studying? How many movies have you watched in the last week? How many movies have you watched in the last week? How many push-ups can you do in a row? How many push-ups can you do in a row? How many steps do you walk in a day? How many steps do you walk in a day? How many cups of water do you drink daily? How many cups of water do you drink daily? How many hours a week do you spend on hobbies? How many hours a week do you spend on hobbies? How many minutes does it take you to get ready in the morning? How many minutes does it take you to get ready in the morning? How many years have you been in your current job? How many years have you been in your current job? How many hours a day do you spend watching TV? How many hours a day do you spend watching TV? How many days a week do you work out? How many days a week do you work out? How many likes do you typically get on social media posts? How many likes do you typically get on social media posts? How many times do you eat out per week? How many times do you eat out per week? How many days a week do you practice mindfulness? How many days a week do you practice mindfulness? How many unread messages do you have on messaging apps? How many unread messages do you have on messaging apps? How many times do you travel per year? How many times do you travel per year? How many hours a day do you spend in meetings? How many hours a day do you spend in meetings? How many hours a week do you spend studying for exams? How many hours a week do you spend studying for exams? How many days a week do you meditate? How many days a week do you meditate? How many hours a week do you spend in traffic? How many hours a week do you spend in traffic? How many emails do you send per day? How many emails do you send per day? How many hours a week do you spend listening to podcasts? How many hours a week do you spend listening to podcasts? How many pieces of fruit do you eat per day? How many pieces of fruit do you eat per day? How many subscriptions do you have? How many subscriptions do you have? How many hours a day do you spend on work-related tasks? How many hours a day do you spend on work-related tasks? How many days a week do you go grocery shopping? How many days a week do you go grocery shopping? How many photos do you take on average per day? How many photos do you take on average per day? How many hours a day do you spend on creative projects? How many hours a day do you spend on creative projects? How many times a week do you see friends in person? How many times a week do you see friends in person? How many hours a week do you spend in meetings? How many hours a week do you spend in meetings? How many hours a week do you spend in nature? How many hours a week do you spend in nature? How many times do you text your friends per day? How many times do you text your friends per day? How many languages can you speak fluently? How many languages can you speak fluently? How many pets do you own? How many pets do you own? How many cities have you lived in? How many cities have you lived in? How many hours of sleep do you get each night? How many hours of sleep do you get each night? How many photos do you take in a typical week? How many photos do you take in a typical week? How many days a week do you exercise? How many days a week do you exercise? How many unread emails do you have right now? How many unread emails do you have right now? How many hobbies do you actively pursue? How many hobbies do you actively pursue? How many hours do you spend commuting each day? How many hours do you spend commuting each day? How many movies have you watched this month? How many movies have you watched this month? How many pieces of art do you have in your home? How many pieces of art do you have in your home? How many close relatives do you have? How many close relatives do you have? How many work projects are you currently managing? How many work projects are you currently managing? How many unread messages do you have on your phone? How many unread messages do you have on your phone? How many volunteer activities do you participate in? How many volunteer activities do you participate in? How many close friends have you made in the past year? How many close friends have you made in the past year? How many photos do you have printed and displayed? How many photos do you have printed and displayed? How many different cuisines have you tried? How many different cuisines have you tried? How many miles do you drive in a typical week? How many miles do you drive in a typical week? How many work meetings do you attend per week? How many work meetings do you attend per week? How many unread notifications do you have on your phone? How many unread notifications do you have on your phone? How many plants do you have in your home? How many plants do you have in your home? How many close friends do you keep in touch with regularly? How many close friends do you keep in touch with regularly? How many times a week do you cook at home? How many times a week do you cook at home? How many concerts do you attend in a year? How many concerts do you attend in a year? How many unread messages do you have on social media? How many unread messages do you have on social media? How many hours a week do you spend outdoors? How many hours a week do you spend outdoors? How many vacations do you take in a year? How many vacations do you take in a year? How many new recipes do you try per month? How many new recipes do you try per month? How many pieces of furniture do you own? How many pieces of furniture do you own? How many times a week do you go out to eat? How many times a week do you go out to eat? How many unread articles do you have saved? How many unread articles do you have saved? How many hours a week do you spend on self-care? How many hours a week do you spend on self-care? How many new people do you meet in a month? How many new people do you meet in a month? How many hours a week do you spend with friends? How many hours a week do you spend with friends? How many unread notifications do you have on your computer? How many unread notifications do you have on your computer? How many times a month do you exercise outdoors? How many times a month do you exercise outdoors? How many times a month do you attend cultural events? How many times a month do you attend cultural events? How many different sports have you tried? How many different sports have you tried? How many different types of cuisine do you cook regularly? How many different types of cuisine do you cook regularly? How many hours a week do you spend on professional development? How many hours a week do you spend on professional development? How many times a week do you go for a walk? How many times a week do you go for a walk? How many hours a week do you spend on personal projects? How many hours a week do you spend on personal projects? How many times a month do you visit museums or galleries? How many times a month do you visit museums or galleries? How many different hobbies have you tried? How many different hobbies have you tried? How many times a week do you visit the gym? How many times a week do you visit the gym? How many hours a week do you spend on home improvement projects? How many hours a week do you spend on home improvement projects? How many times a month do you try new restaurants? How many times a month do you try new restaurants? How many different types of exercise do you enjoy? How many different types of exercise do you enjoy? How many hours a week do you spend on spiritual practices? How many hours a week do you spend on spiritual practices? How many times a month do you attend social events? How many times a month do you attend social events? How many hours a week do you spend on relaxation activities? How many hours a week do you spend on relaxation activities? How many times a week do you practice mindfulness or meditation? How many times a week do you practice mindfulness or meditation? How many different languages can you understand? How many different languages can you understand? How many hours a week do you spend on side projects? How many hours a week do you spend on side projects? How many times a month do you attend cultural festivals? How many times a month do you attend cultural festivals? How many different types of art do you appreciate? How many different types of art do you appreciate? How many hours a week do you spend on community service? How many hours a week do you spend on community service?